This is Harry Murray at Murray's Fly Shop in Edinburgh, Virginia. What we're going to talk about today is the minnow matching tactics that we use for smallmouth bass. I was fortunate to be raised right here in Edinburgh, Virginia, right beside the North Fork of the Shenandoah River, and I got to know the various minnows that we use to fish with baits, live baits when I was a kid. And then when I got into trout fishing, I realized that we played what we called a match the hatch game with the trout game. If we saw a March brown mayfly, we'd dig out a Mr. Rapidan. If we saw Ephemerella dolthea, we'd dig out a sulfur. So we were using flies to match the natural insects. So since I knew the minnows, I thought, why not come up with actual fly patterns in the form of streamers to match the various minnows that we were going to imitate. The Madtoms and Sculpins that we have in our river are very prolific. We find them in the riffles, sometime in the tail of the pools, but it's one of the richest foods that we have for the smallmouth. When I was a kid, all the old timers would use these Madtoms and the Sculpins for the live bait that they used. So I developed this fly that you see here that does look quite a bit like the Madtom and the Sculpin that we're using today. In fishing this Madtom Sculpin, we actually want to fish where the naturals are found. Now, where you see Jeff standing, he would enter the river a little bit upstream and a little bit to the right of where you see him there. And his first cast would be on that number 1 angle. He would cast across, strip it across there about 6 inches every 5 seconds, and swim it right across the bottom there. His second cast would be a little further out, a little further down, and he'd use that same ploy, stripping it right across the bottom of the stream. Then he'd go to the number 3 there and swim it across, and he'd continue this process all the way down through that tight water, because those real minnows are on the bottom of that stream, and that's what Jeff's doing with his Madtom Sculpin, is trying to imitate those real minnows. Now the hog sucker is a pretty gross looking fly when you see it, and actually the natural minnow is a pretty rough looking thing in the water. This was what the old timers in my youth would really use when they were after the big fish. I fished with a number of the older fellows, my father-in-law being one of them. He always wanted the downstream rod when we were using live bait now, and he'd always want to get on the gravel bar. He'd always want a sculpin in that downstream rod, and they caught a lot of fish on this hog sucker. Now the gravel bar you see extending from the right to the left, this water is going to your left as you're looking at that. That angler would cast out where you see number 1, out across that gravel bar, and just strip it back in a very slow, deep motion in order to swim right up that gravel car, because that's where the minnows were living. So that pattern that you just saw, the Magnum hog sucker, would be crawled right up through there, up into the water that actually was probably no more than about a foot deep. Then he'd make cast number 2 a little bit further down. He'd go out into deep water now. He's casting out in the water that's probably, hip deep to chest deep, and then he's swimming it right up that gravel bar where you see number 2, and he'd consider that same ploy as he waded down the river, swimming them right up that gravel bar, and that's where he would catch his big bass. Now, all of the big bass feed on these gravel bars where they're going to get these bluegills. The bluegill, when they hatch out in the spring, by summer they might be up to say 3 inches long, and they're going to eat those bluegill to beat the band. In order to get away from the bass, the bluegill are going to be on marble-sized gravel over along the banks, usually in water, knee deep or maybe just a little bit deeper. They're going back in those shallows to get away from the bass. But the bass do feed very, very heavily on the bluegill. So that's what I'm trying to imitate with that Magnum bluegill streamer. Now, to fish the Magnum bluegill streamer, that angler is wading downstream. His first cast would be tight against the bank back there in number 1. He would drop that over there, hopefully within a foot of the bank. He'd let it sink down close to the bottom, and they were on that bank now. That water is, say, 2 feet deep. He's going to strip it out in a very, very slow stripping action to swim it out maybe 10 feet off the bank. By that time, he has either got his bass or he hasn't. He'd pick that up and then make a little bit longer and a little bit deeper cast down to number 2, and he'd drop it right back against the bank. And again, he's going to swim that out real slowly, stripping it right along the bottom. He gets that out 10, 15 feet off the bank. He's going to pick it up and shoot it right back against the bank, still just a little further downstream. Each one of those casts would be, 5 to 8 feet deeper downstream. Remember now, that water's going from right to left. So what he is doing is working his way right down through that, because that's where those Magnum bluegill are located, and that's where he's putting his fly. The Magnum creek chub, if you don't know what a real creek chub looks like, sort of envision a miniature version of a tarpon. Now, those guys live in every part of the river except around the grass beds. I never see them around the grass beds. They'll be below the riffles, they'll be out in the deep water, they'll be in the fast water, they could be anywhere in there, except they just don't seem to like those gravel bars. So the Magnum creek chub is very, very effective in almost all the other water. The Magnum creek chub, as we said, is distributed through almost all parts of the rivers that where we find smallmouth bass, except around the grass bed. Now, in this case, my son Jeff is floating down the river. He's drifted to this spot. He's hanging his feet down to slow him down. His first cast that you're going to see is over to the right-hand bank at number 1. Now, he's going to shoot it back in there right deep, and he's going to swim that out by stripping it real slowly, maybe 6 inches every 5 seconds. And he's going to swim that from back toward that bank out to that little edge of that riffle. That bass could grab it anywhere in there. Then Jeff is going to pick that up and shoot it over into that number 2 location. Still shooting over toward the bank, swimming it out toward that little riffle. See, the creek chub minnows are lying everywhere in there, and those bass come in after them. His third cast would be further over in there, and by this time he's covered all of that water, and he's probably caught 3 or 4 pretty good bass. Now, he at this point is going to pivot to his left. His next cast is going to be over here at number 4. See, he hadn't touched that water yet. And he's going to drop that cast over there at number 4 and swim it out to him. Now remember, all this current's going away from us as we're sitting here looking at it. So he's swimming that across the stream, catch that bass, pick it up, cast over to number 5, and swim it out right across there. Then he'll pick his feet up and drift on down around that turn and continue that procedure, picking up bass as he goes. The creek chub is just the ideal fly to use when you're drifting the water, either in a boat like you see there or a larger boat or canoe. But it's an excellent tactic and it's very, very effective. Let's talk about the shiner minnows that we have in the river. I'm showing you two different fly patterns that we use here because of the depth of the water where we actually fish these flies. The one on the left is a silver outcast streamer, which is not weighted. I fish that in gravel bars, shallow grass beds, that type thing. On the right, you're seeing the heavy shiner streamer. Now, this could be at the edge of the gravel bars, at the edge of a grass bed, could be in the deep water where those gravel bars would taper off into something maybe 5 feet deep. But both of those are excellent imitations of the shiner streamer. This is a lady that came to Edinburgh to take one of my fishing schools. I started DB out over in what you call casting position number 1 on the right. Now you'll see at the very close in angle there's a gravel bar. Now the water on that gravel bar is probably about a foot deep, and then it tapers on off to where DB is out there now. Now this is one area that I take my smallmouth bass fly fishing schools. We park back on the bank not far from where I'm standing to take that picture. I have everybody walk over real quietly to the stream and then look at what we're calling that gravel bar. If they move gently over there in that water a foot to 2 feet deep, they will see hundreds and hundreds of shiner minnows. Now, the bass feed on those shiners back in that shallow in what I call a hit and run method. They do not feel comfortable just holding in water a foot deep. So the bass would come out of the deep water further out in the middle of the stream, chase those shiners in that gravel bar, and that's where you see DB casting over to the star in the middle when we're saying silver outcast. She'll cast out in front of any bass that she sees coming back in there, and also to cover the water in that taper that drops off into that deeper water out there toward her. All right, after she catches those bass in that, she'll move out to casting position number 2. Now, that's where she'll switch over to that Murray's heavy shiner. The water out in front of DB where she just hooked that fish, probably 5 feet deep. So she'll cast across to where you see our sign saying Murray's heavy shiner. Strip it across about 6 inches every 5 seconds and swim it across there. And DB hooked a very, very big bass right there. He tried to get under that water. She fought him out and got him. But those bass are out in what we've got labeled there as the deep water, and that's where she would use the heavy shiner. And it's very effective. So anytime you see a setup like that, fish it very, very thoroughly. But before you'd wade out to where DB's standing now, keep an eye on the gravel bar, especially real early in the morning and late in the evening. Those bass will come in there and chase those shiners every which way. Now, when you see gravel bars that look like that, that's a peak condition that you would encounter in the spring, let's say from May, June, July. After that, a lot of these shiner minnows leave that gravel bar type area and go to the grass beds. But see, this early in the season, the grass beds haven't formed. So it's sort of a two-phase thing with the shiners. The shiners go where they get the cover. Right now they've got the cover on that gravel bar. Then as the gravel bars taper off. Then we get into the grass beds all along the shaded banks, and they are fantastic. It's my favorite water to fish, to be perfectly honest. On the far bank in front of Jeff, you see that water flowing toward him, and where we have grass beds, those grass beds continue from where we have them labeled on the right all the way up to the far end of that photograph. And these are in water that'll probably average about 2 feet deep. In the low light, like you'll see right there in those shaded areas, those bass will go in there after the shiner minnows. The shiner minnows in those grass beds all the time. But those bass will go in after those grass beds, into those grass beds after the shiners, and he'll be using a silver outcast on this. His first cast would be straight away where you see that first arrow. He's going to drop it back as close to the bank as he can get it and then strip it back. Second cast would be a little further upstream, and then Jeff would move up to casting position number 2 and gradually work his way upstream, covering every bit of that. There's a place on Packhorse Ford over on the Potomac that is so fantastic on the western bank. It's right up there at Packhorse Ford, legal access to anybody on the Potomac. Wade across that, go over to that west bank, and there's probably about almost 100 yards of that heavy grass bed over there in the latter part of the summer, and it is fantastic. And then back here on the north and south fork of the Shenandoah, Jeff's on the North Fork right there, right within stone's throw of the fly shop. But there is some wonderful water over in the South Fork of the Shenandoah, just upstream from Seaford's Landing. I got in there one evening. Now, not only were the shiners back in those grass beds, but the bass were in there chasing them, and I had a ball. It runs maybe 100 yards upstream from Seaford's on the east side of the river. But that is fantastic fishing with the shiner minnows. The photo on the right is a fly I developed several years ago to match the Dace minnows that live in the tails of these pools in the Shenandoah River. Large populations, hundreds and hundreds of these Dace minnows are back in there. I developed this floating minnow type imitation. It's actually a streamer, but we're going to fish it back through there just like a streamer in all of this shallow water. Usually it runs from the gravel bar in the tail of the pool upstream, maybe 150 feet. But it is alive with these minnows, and we use the floating Dace to catch those fish. Charlie Waterman came up to Florida to fish the Shenandoah drainage for smallmouth with me. I had just had Charlie wade in through the riffle. He's crossed up through the riffle. He's in the tail of this pool. Now, some of the hot spots are out in front of him. He would cast out to position number 1. Now we're talking about the Dace minnows back in here. They're everywhere that you see in that shot. There are Dace minnows. So what I had Charlie do, his first cast would be out there to number 1, and he'd strip that back. If he saw a bass chasing a minnow, he'd go for it. Otherwise, he'd strip it back in a very slow strip, pause, strip procedure that would swim it right through what you see there. Catch that bass, pick that cast up, and shoot it out to number 2. And there again, if he sees a bass out there, he's going to go for him. But that slow strip, pause, strip, which moves our fly just a little bit faster than current, which we're really mimicking the real Dace minnows. And then he could just turn, take a couple steps over, and do the same thing over where you see photo number 3. So Charlie would fish all of that. Now, if the water out immediately in front of him gets too deep, he can work his way up this bank, or he can fish across, and it looks like that water on the far side is relatively shallow. He could fish upstream maybe 50 or possibly 100 yards going up that far bank using the same technique with the floating minnow. But that is very effective, especially late in the evening when the sun is off the water. But that is a great way to catch some very big bass. This is a fly that I developed to match the baby bass. A lot of times we just call them smallmouth bass fry. And these, of course, hatch out in the spring. The big bass are interested in feeding on the baby bass in that size, let's say from an inch up to about 3 inches long. Now, to avoid capture, these little baby bass go back against the banks around where they're cobblestones and around brush piles. If you've got brush piles in there, they'll bury way down in those brush piles and hope to get away from the big bass. All right, Jeff has waded downstream and he saw that brush pile out there in the middle of the river. Well, he knew very well that there were a lot of baby bass down in that brush pile. Water out there was probably about 3 feet deep. And Jeff moved down to casting position number 1. His first cast was to location number 1 out there in the upper end of that brush pile. He'd catch 2 or 3 bass in there that are in there after those fry. Second cast would be a little bit further downstream. Same ploy. Number 3, he'd cast in. You see, these are all down under the brush pile. All those babes are down under. The bass are cruising by to try to pick them up. So Jeff would do real well there. Then he would move down to casting position number 2. And he's thinking about going back against the bank. There's a small feeder coming in on that far side. The water against the bank back there is about 2 feet deep. Pea-sized gravel, a couple cobblestones, but it's where the baby bass would feel comfortable. So as Jeff is standing there in casting position number 2, he would cast back to location number 4 and strip it up, strip it up, strip it up. Very slow stripping action because the baby bass can't move very fast. But back in there, I'm almost sure he'd pick up a couple big bass. After he fishes that out up in number 4, he'd cast to number 5 and do that same thing again because the bass fry are back in there and the big bass are cruising there to take advantage of them. Well, what we've done today is show you the flies that we've designed to actually match the minnows in the stream that the bass feed on. For instance, right there, I'm holding a fairly decent smallmouth bass that took that hogsucker streamer that does match the true hogsucker minnow we have in the river. If you'd like to take advantage of this in your own fishing, think about using these streamers that we've talked about, fish them in the areas that we've discussed, and using the techniques that we've just discussed. And this is very effective. If you want to continue your growth in this, we have schools going on all summer long. We have classes in the fly shop here. We have guide trips. We'll be glad to help you any way we can. So give us a ring at the phone number you hear here, or just come in and we can go over the maps with you and show you all the best places to fish. This is Harry Murray at Murray's Fly Shop in Edinburgh, Virginia. Thank you very much for being with us.